Welcome everyone to our webinar today. My name is Nico. I'm a solution architect with Tigera, and the discussion today for our webinar is around designing your Rancher cluster or clusters with Calico. So if you haven't been on any of our webinars before, we do have actually 1 to 2 webinars on a weekly basis, covering a wide variety of topics around networking, network security, and overall network, all the kind of solutions that we can interact with from Tigera's perspective. So today we're focusing more on kind of design considerations and best practices around networking with Rancher and Calico. So the session is being recorded, so you can always go back and watch the recording to your convenience. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel as well as the same site that you registered here today, and we'll send out the slides as well as the video in an email after the session. So real quick about myself, again, I go by Nico. I been with the Tigera for about a year now. Pretty exciting work with partners and customers around overall designing Kubernetes and securing Kubernetes workloads. Prior to that, I was a Docker, and prior to that at Cisco. So pretty much, my whole career on tech has been around kind of intersection of containers, Kubernetes, networking, cloud. So if you have any questions throughout this session, feel free to pop it into the Q&A section, and I'll dedicate a good 10-15 minutes towards the end of our discussion to answer those questions. Also, we have of course the Calico user group Slack group, so always feel free to kind of pop in there and ask your questions from kind of the Slack community. So in today's kind of agenda, we'll go over we did some of the intros. We'll do a quick overview of Calico and Tigera for those who are not familiar with it, with the solution that we provide. Then we'll shift to focus on how you can power your Rancher with Calico, some network design consideration and deployment walkthrough. And we'll leave some questions towards the end for Q&A. So if we take a step back, Calico, Project Calico is provides solutions for network and network security, and you can, pretty much deploy it on any Kubernetes environment. It is widely deployed today in production and at scale. It started as it is an open source community-driven project, started around the same time as Kubernetes, and will also help with some of the other CNCF projects like Spiffy and ACO and Envoy. So in terms of where you can use Calico, by default, actually all of the managed Kubernetes services like EKS, GKE, AKS, IKS have actually chosen Calico as a default policy enforcement engine for their Kubernetes clusters. Which kind of speaks to the trust they have and the technology and the scale that it provides for running production workloads for their customers. And of course, we have we can run Calico anywhere on upstream Kubernetes, on various distribution of Kubernetes, and of course, for our topic today, we'll be focusing on how you can run Calico and the best practice around that with Rancher, whether you're running it on a on-prem or in hybrid environment, and so forth. So that was kind of from a Calico perspective. From a Tigera perspective, Tigera is a company behind Calico. We invented and maintained Project Calico over the past 5-6 years. We'll also could lead some of the STO security working group. And we are aware of today more than actually closer to 200,000 known clusters out there using Calico. So that also is a signal of how ubiquitous it's becoming as a CNI and networking solution and beyond. So we also have a product that's called Calico Enterprise that is trusted by top kind of Fortune 100 enterprises. And it kind of builds on the power of Calico open source and extends to address some of the enterprise use cases around networking and network security and compliance. And that is kind of critical for some of our customers to kind of address those use cases. As you can see here, we have a lot of customers coming from the financial services industries, automotive industry, tech and web, and insurance as well. So we have a wide variety of customers who are using our product today to secure their mission critical applications. Next, so if we switch kind of over to the topic for today around kind of how you can use Calico and Calico Enterprise with to kind of power your Rancher deployments. Of course, Rancher is a very solid and great solution, open source solution, great adoption and within enterprises. It's kind of they have great functionality has been that they provide out of the box. It's not just another Kubernetes distro. There's a lot of innovation around Kubernetes itself that they have pushed, as well as K3S and other projects around multi-cluster management and so forth. And wide adoption around with Rancher. Of course, now they're part of the SUSE acquisition, but they're still kind of delivering a lot of value for their customers. And we work very closely with Rancher to address some of the user and customer requirements when it comes to networking and network security. If you're familiar with Rancher, it's kind of it provides a lot of options around all the plugins that you can use with Kubernetes, but specifically we can we'll be kind of digging into what they provide in terms of the networking options and how you can tie that with Tegera solutions here, both from an open source as well as a commercial product. So out of the box, Rancher provides a couple of CNI options. If you go to their documentation or if you're provisioning their cluster, you can see that they have 4 out of the box CNIs that they support. Canal is being the default, Flannel, Weave, and Calico. Canal is basically a combination of Flannel and Calico. Flannel for networking, Calico for network policies, but they also support Calico. And within Calico, you have 2 options. You can do Calico open source or Calico Enterprise. This is a good kind of from their side. This is a good summary of some of the comparing some of the available options. Actually, it needs some updates. I did submit a PR for them, and I believe it's updated right now in their docs around encryption. But let's kind of walk through a couple of high-level areas where it's important to kind of look into the various options when it comes to picking your CNI. So starting off with the networking model, which is kind of critical as you're kind of building your cluster, it's important to understand what are the requirements when it comes to how you plan to have the pod network with each other. Is it going to be running within your on-prem data center or cloud or a hybrid of those? That can also indicate or kind of help you decide which network model you need to kind of ensure that the CNI provides. An example of that would be, whether you want to use to kind of incorporate your pod networking with your what's called the underlay, the actual underlay of networking. So if you're deploying within your data center, if you want to have a pod kind of use IP addressing from your own network, or have it be totally encapsulated and be only specific to the cluster. And with that, you have with encapsulation mode, you have 2 options from Calico. Others have, I think they're mostly VXLAN based, but Calico provides either IP and IP or VXLAN based encapsulation, in addition to having a no encapsulation option. Of course, if you have, depending on the model that you take, of course, with VXLAN, it's kind of layer 2 technology. With Calico, we're providing layer 3 network for pods. So we take care of kind of route distribution under the hood. We use BGP which kind of is the backbone of the internet, so it's highly scalable, to route, advertise routes of pods and so forth within the cluster. And network policy is an area where you want to make sure that the CNI actually does provide a mechanism to enforce your network policies, and that's why you can see this being Canal having, it does provide it because it's a combination of Calico and Flannel. So Calico does provide that out of the box, creating a full mesh or partial mesh of network between the nodes. The external data store is basically just where the CNI stores its data around configurations and so forth. We both support both using etcd directly or the Kubernetes API, which at the end of the day stores it within etcd. In terms of encryption, there's a need to provide encryption at layer 3. Then actually this should be yes. We actually now support encryption with WireGuard out of the box to provide pod-to-pod encryption. And of course, the policies should be, policy enforcement should be kind of straightforward in terms of Calico's capability to enforce Kubernetes network policies as well as Calico network policies, there's a difference between the two in both direction, ingress and egress. So I think those are some of the key areas where when you're comparing CNIs, it's important to kind of look into those, and we're going to touch more in detail in the next couple of slides. So why even consider Calico as a CNI when you're deploying your Rancher clusters? I've heard that. I've been working with customers for a few years around Kubernetes, and the past year with Tigera. Sometimes if you're just doing some basic testing for a cluster, and they're used basically early on in terms of your adoption, or even if you have adopted Kubernetes, but for certain purposes you have, you launch clusters for development purposes or kind of small scale clusters. Usually the topic of networking is not really brought up, or it's not as critical because you just want something that works out of the box. You don't need to care much about that. But once you begin really, or if you want to design something that is scalable, ready for mission critical applications, addresses some of the more complex use cases that you might have, and something that is fast, then this is where you kind of have to look and really study the design considerations in what each of the CNIs provides and what the solutions around the CNI provide to address those requirements. So in working with some of our users, I noted down some of the reasons why why Calc can really power your Rancher clusters, and I'm just going to go through them one by one here. First of all, the Calico Cuddle is provide that it's kind of simple, easy to use tool to manage anything related to networking. Kubectl is great, but if you want to kind of have a networking centric and easy to use tool for both interactive command line with Kubernetes or with Calico, or if you want to integrate it as part of your any like CI or GitOps based kind of deployments, it's a great way to Calico can be really helpful for overall management, configuration, and interaction with all things related to networking within your cluster. As we mentioned before, Calico provides various networking options. So whether you want to have direct integration and peering with your underlay, that way you can actually advertise with Calico service IPs or pod IPs into your network, which we have. I work with a lot of customers who have that. So that way they can continue using their tooling and service discovery and whatever they like, because pods are reachable and services are reachable outside of Kubernetes. So they're basically expanding the concepts of services outside of Kubernetes natively through advertising those. So that's a huge advantage to having no encapsulation, as well as using existing tooling and visibility, and of course performance, because you don't have any overhead from encapsulating the traffic. Now, there are some use cases, of course, if you you don't have enough kind of IPs to kind of hand out to the bazillion pods you're about to launch, or you want to basically have it in certain areas where, or certain clusters have certain requirements around just being local and hosting local workloads, then encapsulation is a great choice because they work out of the box. There's no additional configuration. You can use VXLAN or IPNIP to do that with Calico. If you decide to do no encapsulation, you have a lot of peering options. So whether it is on the cloud or on-prem, you can actually peer directly with your top of rack. We have functionalities with dual tours, so really providing kind of high performance, low latency, high availability when it comes to your routing of pods, especially for kind of mission critical applications. It's critical to plan for that. In addition, we can do selective peering. So in things like, selective encapsulation, that was the previous points, where if you have, you can use, VXLAN or IPNP only across subnets or across like availability zones or so forth. So within the same subnet, it's, routing works as expected, but as you're kind of leaving the availability zone or the subnet, you can selectively create, using encapsulation. So it's kind of less overhead to do that. If we move to kind of network policy enforcement, it's really important to think about that because, out of the box, everything, all the pods can communicate freely between each other, even across namespaces. So it's important to think about the security posture and profile of your application and ensure that you're defining policies that are going to secure your application and across on-prem, cloud. It becomes a layer of security that is critical and it's kind of centric around your application running in Kubernetes. Of course, so in terms of support and some of the advancements, I would say that we've been working on both from a data plane perspective as well as kube proxy modes, supporting for IPVS as well as IP tables for kube proxy, as well as we're doing a lot of work with eBPF. So that's a pretty new kind of data plane that we introduced, and it's now GA as part of Calico. And that kind of gives you an edge in terms of performance and latency and some of the advanced functionalities that eBPF supports. Of course, IP tables have been used for quite some time, and it's very stable. But there's a lot of excitement around eBPF and the capabilities that it provides. One thing to note also that if you have any Windows workloads, right, Calico is pretty much the only CNI that can be run in the same cluster to support both Windows workloads, Windows pods, as well as Linux pods. So it's kind of the only supported CNI out there that does support both in one framework, in one place, as well as not only just supporting the functionality of bringing a pod, but also support the network policies for both Windows and Linux workloads. So that was kind of a quick summary of what I would say some of the reasons why, even from an open source perspective, why you can consider Rancher use of Calico, and you can use the Calico to power your Rancher clusters. So let's gonna switch to some of the design considerations that we typically address and work with users on. Like in terms of if you're planning your Kubernetes cluster, or even if you are today, a lot of users that I work with are either migrating off of Flannel, or they're kind of having kind of the next iteration of their Kubernetes platform. So they're going through this exercise. So it doesn't matter where your journey is. Some of the key network consideration that you really have to think about ahead, because when it comes to CNI, although it is feasible and viable to actually switch out the CNI, and there's definitely a lot of configuration that can be changed after kind of you deploy your cluster. But the selection of the CNI itself is something that's going to be difficult for you to change, and some of the configurations are going to be difficult for you to change. That includes kind of the pod siders and service siders. So what you see on the bottom map is the YAML configuration from Rancher, right, to define your cluster. And it's important to think about what to select for your pod sider and service sider. It's going to depend on what range you use is going to depend on a lot of things. One is, of course, how many pods are you planning to run? Of course, there's I think the default for per node, I think number of pods is the limit that Kubernetes enforces is around 110. So you can think about selecting a cider range, whether it is, I'll probably start with a /16 at least. That gives you enough, 65,000 something, enough IPs for a number of pods. But if you need more, you have to kind of think about that earlier, because that's something that you cannot change. The second thing here is that if you are doing if you're not doing encapsulation with VXLAN or IPNP, that means that you're going to be relying on your IP address availability from an IPAM perspective for both the service side as well as the pod side. So if you have /16 available in your network, great. But if not, then you have to probably settle for something else, which is going to limit the number of pods that you're going to be launching. So those are key things to remember when you're defining your Rancher configs here. Same thing for service-sided. I would say the only key difference here, or two key differences. Service-siders are actually not handled at all by the CNI. They're handled by Kubernetes API itself, because they're virtual and they're basically implemented through kubeproxy. So they're not. Calico has no handle of the service-sided, but you need to still define them in your config. The other thing is, like, a lot of times, if you are routing your pods externally, that means that you cannot reuse some of the sites. But if you're not doing any service advertisement outside of the cluster, that means that you can reuse the same site. But then, if you have multiple clusters, you can reuse them. So that's important to think about that. Also, if you're doing encapsulation, you can always and you should always kind of reuse the same cider ranges, because anyway, you can pick a /8 if you want, and it's only going to be relevant within the cluster itself. So additional considerations, like what data plane do I choose between IP tables and eBPF? I would say IP tables. The majority of our customers and users are using IP tables because it's stable and scalable. eBPF is very exciting. We just went GA with it. Definitely a lot of excitement around it. But I would say, it's going to be dependent on if you have the right sort of kernel version, because it does require a more modern version. If you actually really need eBPF functionalities, you can read more about it, and we provide a lot of resources from walkthroughs and advantages and blog and benchmarking with eBPF. So you can check it out under our Tigera.io blog site. So I would say, like, in terms of the data plane to choose, the default is going to be IP tables, and I think I definitely recommend sticking to it unless there's you see the advantage of eBPF, or you have a use case for eBPF that's not addressed with IP tables. So that's one thing. So if you look at the network encapsulation, I think we kind of we answered that. If you do need encapsulation or not, it's going to depend if the environment that you're running in it. For example, if you're running Rancher on Azure, as an example, the type of encapsulation is going to be limited to VXLAN, because Azure networking does not support IP and IP. I believe there are ways you can integrate with the VNet of Azure to do no encapsulation, but you're pretty much left with either, pretty much VXLAN is your only choice for encapsulation on Azure. Where you deploy the cluster, is it on the same layer 2 or across layer 2 domains between kind of the different worker nodes? So if across domains, you can do selective encapsulation. If it's the same domain, you don't need to do any encapsulation with that approach. So it kind of depends on where you're running your cluster or clusters. And I think we talked about kind of initial IP pool sided, and you can basically use Calico to assign specific IPs, what we call through an IP pool. So the first the pod sided is something that is basically important to begin with a large slice of a subnet, and then you can split into multiple IP pools, but you can also create an IP pool that does not belong into that subnet, but it's always important to have the base subnet, the base IP pool that kind of aligns with what we discussed earlier, which is around the cluster CIDR. But Calico can actually help you with defining, or can allow you to define different IP pools. So it could be one, could be like a 10 dot, the other could be 172 dot, and based on namespaces or labels for deployments, select the IP range to be from that specific pool. And there are definitely some use cases for that. Based on if you want to have like routable IPs given to select pods and be scoped to a specific namespace. If you are, for example, we have capabilities around egress gateways where you're asking Calico to assign an IP address that is routable for a specific namespace and is NATed through only that one IP, so that if you have firewalls or whatnot within your environment, you're actually allowing only that specific namespace to communicate and source its traffic from that specific IP or IPs. So that can also be done with Calico. The initial pipe, the block size here is something that we didn't kind of describe, but basically within Calico you can assign an IP range. Typically it's a /26. I think the default /26 per node. So that's going to be used to create all the pods within on that node. Use the same range /26. And the reason why we have that block size defined is that we can minimize the number of advertisements from a routing perspective when you have pods come up. So if you have 100 pods all using the same, or I mean, you can't have 100, let's say they have 30 pods or 40 pods all running on the same node, there's only a single /26 that's being advertised to either your network or your the rest of the nodes. But Calico can also help with dynamic IP addressing, even if you hit the maximum of that /26. And of course, if you need how you want to decide on NAT configuration, if you want to have the pods be, of course, if the traffic is leaving the node, be NATed directly on from that node, or you can actually choose to, as we described earlier, to do egress gateway and be NATed through a common IP that is not specific to the node they're running on, or no NAT at all if you're actually, if the pod is routable. If the pod IP is routable within your environment, then you don't need NAT at all. Another option, if you have NAT gateways in your VPC, you can also use that as well. So let's kind of switch to Calico Enterprise and kind of focus, more on like the kind of the value that we bring in, especially with Rancher. As I said, the power of Calico, just out of the box with Rancher is kind of is tremendous. But of course, when it comes to some of the use cases that we'll describe here, this is where you kind of have to kind of think about trying or using Calico Enterprise, especially around security controls, access controls, and visibility and troubleshooting. We typically, if you are, a Rancher user who's just getting started, building, labs and sandboxes, this is typically not when you want to consider kind of more advanced networking use cases, and you're probably good with just the basic, an open source Calico. But then if you move to kind of pre-production, taking some applications to production and mass migration to Kubernetes, this is where we helped a lot of customers really address some of the challenges that come with those stages. And we grouped those use cases into 9 use cases, ranging from egress access controls to multi-tenancy, microsegmentation, enterprise security controls, visibility, and troubleshooting. I want to kind of summarize, I would say, especially that we probably have a technical group here, so I don't want to bore you with the marketing aspect of it, but summarize some of the advantages with Calico Enterprise into 5 key advantages: policy tiers, advanced flow logs, flow visualization, DNS policies, and multi-cluster management. So first of all, policy tiers, when it comes to Kubernetes network policies, you can either, typically with just Kubernetes and open source Calico, you can deploy a policy and it's a flat approach. So there's, you can, with RBAC, you can either deploy a policy or not. With the take we have with Calico Enterprise's network tiers is you can actually create tiers for different groups that are either managing or controlling the environment, like a security team or infosec team, in which they can define policies that can be global in scope. That means it can be running, it can be addressing all namespaces or all workloads in the cluster, where those policies are enforced first before user or application developer kind of define or kind of enforce their own sets of policies, if that makes sense. So by providing this kind of hierarchy in tiers, you can ensure as you add more applications or namespaces or projects into your environment, you have a precedence and in how you deploy or how you enforce policies, and ensure there's some consistency around policy enforcement before individual teams kind of deploy their own application-specific policy. So that's one key differentiator. The second is around advanced flow logs. So typically, you want to capture flow logs for all the traffic. We're not talking about kind of deep packet inspection. We're just talking about ensuring that you have full visibility on all the flow logs that are happening, whether it's east-west traffic, north-south traffic. The problem with Kubernetes is that if you just look at the traffic, it can be even more complex if you have encapsulation. But even if you don't, just looking at the source and destination IP and port of the pod is not going to give you much, because that could be, by the time you actually look at the data, that IP could be for a different pod. It could be for a different environment. You don't have much sense of the data. So what we do is we capture not only those traditional flow logs, but we add, we have Kubernetes context over like the namespace, the service, the pod labels, and like I think 38 other metadata, and the policy, of course, that is protecting this workload. And we store that in Elastic within our within Calico, and you can actually view it, you can actually export it, but that can give you the data around all the traffic within your cluster, so you can always go back in time and figure out what happened for specific workflows and why they were blocked or why there's any issues with them quickly to kind of isolate any issues. Third, the flow visualizer that we provide out of the box based on the data from the advanced flow logs. We actually have a flow visualizer that can help you and your teams drill down into each of the namespaces or the workflows and fully understand the different flows that are happening, whether we're talking about flows within the cluster, east-west, or anything incoming to the cluster from an ingress perspective, or leaving the cluster to the public or other resources. You can drill down, everything is R-backed, so even your development team can get and only see their namespace, and you can drill down into and gain full visibility into what's going on. That can be really helpful for troubleshooting, very helpful for fully understanding what's going on, so you don't feel blind when running Kubernetes. Third is around, maybe this is the fourth one. Anyway, next, the key differentiator is around egress, access control. So if you have a lot of applications running on the same Kubernetes cluster, you want to make sure that you give the right set of egress policies and permissions for pods, even if they're residing in the same set of nodes, worker nodes, that they have different permissions to access what they need to access. An example of that, if you want certain pods, in this case, like pod B running on the node, Kubernetes node, to be able to talk to Twilio API, but not be able to talk to the Oracle database that is running, or the RDS instance that is running within your VPC or within your account. So having a selective mechanism to do that, especially for resources outside of Kubernetes where you can't really use labels, is where this DNS-based policies can come in handy. So you can define domain-based or subdomain-based rules when you create the policies and have it be applied to the pod level, the namespace level, you name it. So that's going to be really critical as you onboard more applications onto your Kubernetes cluster. Finally, with kind of mimicking the great way that the Rancher does multi-cluster management, From a networking perspective, it's also critical to have that leverage when it comes to managing multiple clusters. If you have, dev prod cluster, or if you have multiple environments, at some point it's going to be critical to have a single point of management with local kind of sovereignty, I would say, but at least from a high level perspective, gain single UI to centralize and kind of understand what's going on, get any alerts from what's going on across multiple clusters, drill down into the various flows and flow logs that we described across multiple clusters, as well as we also have a mechanism to federate policies, so create policies and push them to multiple Rancher clusters or multiple clusters across different environments, or even multiple clusters across different distros, like a Rancher and EKS, or a OpenShift and Rancher, right? That can be really handy. So just wanted to kind of highlight something before I kind of do a quick quick note around like how to get started with Calico on Rancher, but and I'll kind of describe the two key differences whether you're running Calico open source or enterprise. So with Calico open source, really, let me actually exit out of here. With Calico open source, really, this is something I'll post in the chat as well. You really have can use the definition, the config, and just use Calico in the network. Where is it? Just use the plugin equals Calico, and that's all you really need to get started with Rancher using Calico. Rancher automatically takes care of launching your cluster or clusters with Calico. It's going to use the definition of your service cluster IP range, and that would be kind of translated into the Calico configuration, and out of the box you get everything working, and you can start running your cluster that way. Now, so that is from an open source perspective. It is supported from Rancher, and all you have to do is really just change the config to say plugin equals Calico. That's really about it. The other aspect here is that if you're trying to do Calico Enterprise, right? Let's go back to try to do Calico Enterprise. We do have, standard system requirements overall, just to make sure that you're launching enough, we're launching system requirements that match what we have for what we need for Calico Enterprise. We provide, Takeda credentials or license if you're a customer. And we do have a trial process. I'll talk about that towards the end of the discussion today. The only key thing is, of course, if you have to have access to the Rancher RP cluster, and ensure that you are able to provision persistent volumes from a configured storage class. But the most critical thing, in my opinion, is that if you are planning to use Calico Enterprise here, the most critical thing to do is to ensure that when you're launching the cluster, you actually don't specify a plugin. So it's going to launch and be in this mode right here. As you can see, when I launch this cluster, really, I made sure that I have the plugin equals to none. You'll have, the node is not active, but that's okay because the CNI is not there and Kubernetes needs the CNIs. But the kubelets is running, the API server is running, etcd is running, and so forth. So that's really the only thing I wanted to kind of highlight. The issue with kind of running through a full installation is going to take longer, but I'm going to post the configuration options here and the workflow to install Calico as well as Calico Enterprise in the chat, and so you can follow it on your own. But that's the key requirement here is around the making sure that you have PV for Calico Enterprise and making sure you have no network plugin installed when you launch Rancher, and then you can go through the proper documentation that we have, which is if you go to docs.takeda and you look at installing Calico Enterprise, and you look at Kubernetes, self-managed, and then you have Rancher. And it's really straightforward. It defines some of the requirements here. Shouldn't take more than 10-15 minutes to go through this with a couple options, and by the end of it, you should have a fully functional Calico Enterprise platform that is running on top of Rancher, that's providing the CNI functionality as well as all the security functionalities that I described right here. That being said, let's, hopefully this was kind of helpful in terms of the content. Before we kind of switch to questions, I wanted to kind of point out a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, we do have a lot of upcoming events for you. This is today. We have multi-cluster management. My peer, John, does an amazing job describing how you can use multi-cluster management to not only federate policies, but also federate identities and services. So you can actually write policies and use the federated identity that we provide out of the box to secure your applications, especially when they're communicating across multiple Rancher clusters or multiple Kubernetes clusters. We also have a lot of other upcoming events like troubleshooting services on Kubernetes, and similar event on similar to this, but it's more focused on AKS. So feel free to kind of head to Tigera.io/events to sign up for those. And again, they will be recorded just free training for you. The other thing is we're really excited about is we have this Introduction to Kubernetes Networking ebook. I will post, the slides will be sent to you, but after this, I'll post the links to those, but we just launched a Kubernetes Networking ebook that is free for you, so you can actually download it and go through it, going through some of the core concepts and learnings around overall Kubernetes networking constructs, services, pod networking, DNS, and so forth. So it's really a great ebook for you to have. And also, we're really excited about launching the Calico certification. So we are launching pre-registration right now for a Calico certification course. I believe it will be free, but I'll provide the link for the pre-registration. So if you go and register, we'll update you on the certification that we are launching. So if you're trying to become more of an expert around Kubernetes networking and network security, it's going to be great for you to go through that and get registered and receive that free certification there. Finally, if you would like to get access to Calico Enterprise running on Rancher, a really easy way to do that is to go to the link I'll send, the Tigera trial. We can provide you, if you just give us a couple of info, no credit card needed, you can actually pick Rancher as an option, and you can get the cluster, fully functional Kubernetes cluster with Calico Enterprise, and we provide 4 or 5 labs that are really intuitive, extremely helpful to fully understand the capabilities, not just purely from a Calico Enterprise perspective, but overall network security for Kubernetes. So feel free to kind of also to head that way. I'll post the links in the chat, and they will be also, we send them usually with the emails after the webinar. That being said, I'm happy to take some questions. I'm going to stop the sharing right now so I can see them. So feel free to kind of raise your questions if you haven't, but hopefully this was a good session for you so far.